Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from a representative of tRIIO, which was the body instructed by Cadent Gas to fit the new riser in Grenfell Tower. Yes, Ms Grange.
Yes, Mr Chairman. Can we call Mr Matthew Dolan, please?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr Dolan.
Morning.
I gather you're going to make the affirmation.
I am, yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So if you'd like to read the words on the screen, that would be appropriate. Thank you.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, do sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right? Yep. Good. Thank you. Yes, Ms Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, can you give the inquiry your full name, please?
It's Matthew John Dolan.
Thank you. And thank you very much for coming to the inquiry today to assist us with our investigations. It's very much appreciated. If you have any difficulty in understanding any of the questions that I ask you today, please just ask me to repeat the question or I'll put the point in a different way. We will take scheduled breaks today. If you feel you need an additional break, please just say. And please try and keep your voice up so that the transcriber who's sitting to your right can take a nice clear note of your evidence. Okay. Thank you. Now, we have two witness statements from you. If we can go to the first, this is at MET 3012711. This is a statement dated the 5th of February 2018, which you gave to the Metropolitan Police. It's 18 pages long. We'll call that your first statement. Can we also pull up your inquiry statement? This is at tRIIO 401797. So this is the statement that you made to the inquiry. If we look at page 10, we can see it's dated the 5th of October 2018. And is that your signature there?
It is, yes.
Now, have you read both of these statements recently?
I have.
Thank you. And can you confirm that the contents are true?
They're correct, yeah.
Thank you. And have you discussed the evidence you're going to give today with anyone before coming here this morning?
Only people directly involved in putting the statement together.
I see.
Yeah.
Were those your lawyers?
Lawyers, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we know that you were involved in the Grenfell Tower project because you worked for the entity that we know as tRIIO. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, what sort of entity was tRIIO? Can you explain?
Yeah, tRIIO was a joint venture between Morrison Utility Services and Skanska Construction. It was awarded an 8-year contract at the back end of 2012 to deliver, amongst other things, gas mains replacement, multiple occupancy building and connections work for National Grid.
Yes, thank you.
Which later become Cadent Gas.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. And it was formed specifically to bid for contracts with National Grid. Is that correct?
It was, yes.
And as you've just mentioned, we know that in 2016, National Grid changed its name to Cadent. We'll call it Cadent today in the questioning. And as you said, so we know that on the 18th of December 2012, tRIIO was awarded the contract for gas distribution services in the North London region for Cadent. Is that correct?
It was, and also the East of England. So there was 2 contracts that were awarded.
Yes.
One for London Network and one for the East of England network.
Yes, thank you. And that contract was known as the Gas Distribution Strategic Partnership, the GDSP.
That's correct.
Is that right? And it was an exclusive contract for tRIIO to do all the work in defined regions. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've mentioned already, and Mr. Harrison told us yesterday, that the term of that contract was for 8 years.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. And is it right that that came to an end, it terminated by expiry in December 2020?
Yes.
And is it right that tRIIO as a joint venture doesn't exist anymore?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, you helpfully set out a summary of what tRIIO was contracted to provide in your first witness statement. If we can go to that at page 2, so that's your MET statement. I want to look at paragraph 10. you tell us there, it's right at the bottom of that page, if we can blow that up.
Yes.
You say, under the contract, tRIIO carries out work in London to replace existing metallic gas mains with new polyethylene gas mains, lay new gas mains and install new connections. Work is done on the instruction of Cadent, which owns the gas network. This includes providing a design and construction service for replacement gas networks in multi-occupancy buildings, MOBs, of which around 80% of the MOB's programme works arise from reports from the public and others relating to gas leaks, reactive works, and the remaining 20% relate to planned replacement programmes, proactive works. Now, we've heard from Mr. Harrison yesterday, and I just want you to confirm that the gas riser works which tRIIO carried out at Grenfell Tower started at the beginning of October 2016, but had not been completed by the night of the fire in June 2017. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And just to be clear, it's right, isn't it, that tRIIO did this work to the gas pipes at Grenfell Tower under the strategic partnership contract?
Yes.
And tRIIO provided the design for those works, yes?
Yes.
And also managed the construction services for those works?
Yes, we did.
Yes, thank you. And in that paragraph that we just read, paragraph 10, in the second sentence, second line, you begin there by saying, work is done on the instruction of Cadent. Can you just explain precisely what you mean by that?
So in the context of the reactive MOBS programme, we would have been issued with what is known as a client brief, a MOBS pro forma, which is an instruction to commence the design and construction activities associated with the replacement of the gas riser that had been cut off due to public reported gas escape.
Yes. And once you take on responsibility for that design, is it fair to say that you're not being instructed by Cadent about the design? It's up to tRIIO then to plan that design work. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were the designer, the principal designer and the principal contractor for that work.
Yeah. And in terms of your role, can you just help? When did you start working for tRIIO?
I started working on the tRIIO contracts on the 1st of April 2013. I joined as a programme and compliance manager.
Yes.
And then became a contract director. I'm just going to get it right here in terms of the start of year 4, which would have been 2016.
Yes.
2016.
Yes. So we'd got in around April 2016 you
Yes.
became contract director. Does that sound right?
That's right, yes.
Yes. And from March 2018, did you become Director of Operations?
I did.
Yes. Thank you. Now, just going back again to your first statement, this time one page on page 3, if we look at paragraph 11, you tell us here, at any one point in time, tRIIO has approximately 500 projects ongoing, of which around 20 to 30 can be MOB, multi-occupancy buildings projects. I am one of 2 of tRIIO's contract directors responsible for the delivery of the overall programme of works, with part of my area of responsibility relating to the design and construction of the MOB's projects for both the London and East of England networks. Now, just to clarify, at the date you made that statement, you were still a contract director at tRIIO.
I was.
Is that correct? And that was your role at the time of the works at Grenfell Tower. Is that correct? Yes. And you tell us there that there were 2 contract directors. Can you just help, how was the role divided up? Did you have different areas of responsibility?
Yeah, so my area of responsibility, I looked after operations for the London network, and I had design, health and safety responsibility for both the London and East of England network. And then my counterpart had operational responsibility for the East of England, plus he looked after customer services and some other activities. But my responsibility was London network operations, design for both contracts, London and the East of England, plus health and safety for both contracts, London and East of England.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. Can you just keep your voice up a little bit? Because it's dipping down a little bit at the end, just so we can get a clear note. Thank you. Yes. And typically, how many multi-occupancy building projects would you be looking after at any one time?
So at any one point, as in my statement, around 20 to 30,
Yes.
predominantly in London network.
Right,
In
yes.
fact, the vast majority of the MOBS projects were in the London network.
Yes. And in terms of the Grenfell Tower project, what direct involvement did you have, first of all, with the design of the new riser at Grenfell Tower?
So I would have had very little direct responsibility. I had overall responsibility, but in terms of day-to-day delivery of the design and construction work, that would have been discharged through my team.
Yes. And what about the construction work at Grenfell Tower? Again, what was your direct involvement in that?
Very similar to the design. So I would have had an operations manager responsible for the delivery of the project and a design manager responsible for the design of the project.
Yes.
So they were direct reports of mine.
Yes. And is it right that you did have some involvement during the works when problems were escalated to you?
Yes, so there was specific problems that occurred, notably an asbestos incident that occurred in one of the flats, and I would have been notified of any complaints that would have been escalated to me if they couldn't be resolved by my team.
Yes, thank you. Now, in terms of your own background, is it right that you're a gas engineer by training?
Yes, I started in the gas industry in 1988 and spent 25 years working for British Gas, Transco and National Grid before joining the tRIIO contract in 2013.
Yes, thank you. And is it right that you did your training at National Grid before it became Cadent?
I did, yeah.
Yes. And when did you commence that training?
Training was ongoing throughout my 25 years working for National Grid and its predecessor company. So dependent upon the role I was undertaking, training would have been involved in supporting me in the delivery of that particular job or those particular jobs.
Yes, thank you. And in 2010, you took on the role of engineering manager at National Grid. Is that right?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yes. And was that a senior role within National Grid?
Yes, it was a senior management role.
Yes, thank you. So to summarise, before you started working at tRIIO, you'd worked as a gas engineer for over 25 years.
Yeah, I joined the gas industry when I was 21 in 1988.
Yes, thank you. And are you still working in the gas industry?
I am, yes.
Yes. Now, I want to ask you a little bit more now about the relationship between tRIIO and Cadent. We heard from Mr. Harrison yesterday that Cadent, as a gas transporter, has statutory duties, for example, in connecting customers to gas and keeping the pipeline in safe and efficient working order. Now, is it right that the contract with tRIIO was designed to assist Cadent in fulfilling those obligations?
Yes.
And under that contract, tRIIO was Cadent's contractor, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, it's also right, isn't it, that the relevant gas regulations themselves are in functional form, i.e. they set out goals, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So rather than prescribing exactly what the gas transporter has to do, they set out these functional requirements?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. And is it right that in order to achieve those goals, the industry frequently refers to a range of different guidance, including HSE guidance, industry technical standards, and other British and European standards? Is that correct?
Yeah, there'll be a hierarchy of documentation specifications that we would refer to.
Yes. Mr. Stephen Mason of Cadent has provided several witness statements to the Metropolitan Police and to the inquiry. He was the operations director for Cadent. I just want to look at something he says in one of his statements. If we could bring that up at CAD 403005 at page 3. And I want to look at paragraph 11. So there, he tells us, he says, this contract, that's the one between Cadent and tRIIO, underpins the relationship between Cadent and tRIIO and sets out the contractual relationship for this 8-year period. tRIIO, as contractor for works under the contract, is required to comply with all statutory requirements, including the CDM regulations, as defined in paragraph 16 below, and any obligations imposed by the Health and Safety Executive or Ofgem, relevant British or European standards or codes of practice, and best practice guidelines in respect of health and safety, as are applicable to the activities carried out under the contract. Now, do you agree with what Mr. Mason says there in terms of... Yes. Thank you. And just to be clear, the best practice guidelines that he's referring to, around 5 lines down, he says best practice guidelines in respect of health and safety. Would, for example, the publication IGEM G5 be classified as good practice guidance?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if we go over the page in his statement to page 4 and look at paragraph 12, he says at the beginning there, as part of the contract, tRIIO is required to work in accordance with a number of cadence policies, procedures and industry standards, which includes IGEM G5. And you tell us in your second witness statement, I don't think we need to turn it up, but page 6, paragraph 23, you tell us that tRIIO applied the IGEM G5 standard when designing and constructing the gas supply replacement works. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you also tell us that this summarises best practice and guidance from legislation and existing gas industry standards and procedures for gas installations in multi-occupancy buildings. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And just help us, I think we heard yesterday, but IGEM, for those listening, IGEM is the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers.
That's correct.
Yes. And is it right that IGEM issues technical standards for the gas engineering industry?
Yes.
We can see IGEM G5 at, if we look at, it's an exhibit to Mr. Hancock's report, he's the inquiry's gas expert, at RHX 705. We can see that this is the second edition of IGEM G5, gas in multi-occupancy buildings. And this version was issued in 2012 and was the current issue at the time of the gas replacement works at Grenfell Tower. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And I think you agree, but just to confirm, you agree that tRIIO was required to work to this standard and meet the technical requirements that it set out?
That's correct.
Would you have expected the tRIIO design team to have been familiar with it?
Yes.
Now, under the building regulations regime, there was also practical guidance in the form of a number of approved documents, including something called Approved Document B on fire safety. Were you familiar with that document at the time you were responsible for the Grenfell Tower design works?
I was familiar with the building regulations, but not specifically the approved document B that you referenced.
Yes. Would you expect that those at tRIIO who were designing the works, the replacement riser works, would have been familiar with Approved Document B insofar as it has sections relevant to gas works?
I would have expected the design team to be familiar with the document. I'm not sure I can answer whether or not they would have been specifically understood that particular section.
Yes.
They would have recognised the building regulation, but maybe not the fire safety order section that you referenced.
Right, yes. Let's just pull up Approved Document B. It's at CLG 50224. There it is. It's quite a long document. It contains a lot of practical guidance. Just to be absolutely clear about your answer, you would have expected the tRIIO designers to have been familiar and aware of this document, yes?
They would have been aware of the building regulations document, yes.
When you say aware of the building regulations document, do you mean this practical guidance or do you mean the building regulations themselves?
Building regulations themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
So they will have been aware of the functional requirements in the building regulations? Yes. But not necessarily familiar with this detailed practical guidance?
That's correct.
Yeah. Is it right that in 2016 and 2017, a gas engineer would have referred primarily to the IGEM standards in terms of health and safety?
Yes.
And would that be the only guidance document that a gas engineer would have referred to in their work? Or would there be other guidance documents that you can think of that were likely to come up more frequently?
To clarify, in the context of the MOBS programme of works, the design team and the operational team would have referenced IGEM G5.
Yes, thank you. And is it right that in 2016 and 2017, tRIIO designers would have believed that if their design complied with the technical requirements of IGEM G5, then it would also comply with all other relevant standards?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. Now, we saw reference to the CDM regulations, the Construction Design and Management Regulations, in Mr. Mason's statement. And I think you accept in your first statement that the CDM regulations applied to the work of the Strategic Partnership Contract, yes?
Yes, yep.
And it's right, isn't it, that as part of your contract with Cadent, tRIIO had designated roles and had to abide by the CDM regulations, is that correct?
Yes.
For the Grenfell Tower project, do you recall which particular CDM roles tRIIO had under the 2015 CDM regulations?
I do, yes.
Yes, what were those?
Principal designer,
Yes,
designer, and
Yes.
principal contractor.
yes. So all three distinct roles,
Yes.
tRIIO held those, is that correct?
We did, yes.
Yes. Now, we know that the role of principal designer was a new role created in the 2015 regulations that had not existed previously. Can you help us? What training did tRIIO undertake to take on this new role when the new regulations came in?
Cadent approached us when the new duty holder role came into place to take on that role. We engaged the services of an external consultant, namely Arup. Arup came in and reviewed our business processes, our health and safety documentation, our capability, and they produced what in effect was a gap analysis report, which identified those parts that we currently complied with and therefore could take on that role, and the parts that we would have to do some additional training and development of processes to enable us to fulfil the full role.
Yes.
There was a plan. That plan was actioned, and then we were in a position to take on the role of principal designer,
Yes.
and that was agreed contractually with Cadent.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. And had that plan all been actioned by the time the Grenfell Tower project started?
It had, yes.
Yes. So did tRIIO take steps to make sure that somebody with the necessary CDM competencies was engaged in any particular project?
Our design team, in the context of the design, fulfilled both CDM training and also training in G5 when that was issued to us.
Yes. Now, if we could look at your first statement, again, your MET statement at page 4, paragraph 20 this time. You tell us there, as principal designer, tRIIO had responsibility to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate health and safety during the pre-construction phase and to liaise with the principal contractor during the delivery of the construction work. Now, as principal designer, would you accept that tRIIO had a duty to assess the health and safety risks throughout the life cycle of the whole project?
Yes.
So not just at the beginning, not just at the end, but actually throughout the works itself?
Throughout the works and post-completion, for any inspection and maintenance that would be needed for the pipeline once commissioned.
Yes. And can we agree that the principal designer has other duties, such as assisting the client with preparing pre-construction information?
That's right, yeah.
Monitoring the construction phase, coordinating health and safety matters during construction?
Yes.
And identifying, eliminating or controlling foreseeable risks?
Yes.
Thank you. And at the end of a project like this one, where more than one contractor was involved, the principal designer prepares the health and safety file and passes that completed file to the client. Is that your understanding?
That is correct.
Now, as you've mentioned, tRIIO was also a designer for the purposes of the CDM regulations. And if we look again at your first statement, now at paragraph 21, same page, you tell us that as designer, tRIIO's role was to prepare and modify the design in relation to the in-ground works and riser pipework at the tower. In performing that role, tRIIO's designers took account of pre-construction information provided by Cadent to try to eliminate foreseeable risks to the health and safety of those working on the project, the residents and others affected by the works. In circumstances where the risks could not be eliminated, tRIIO's designers took steps to reduce and control those risks. The design was then shared with the construction team and others working for tRIIO. So we know that the roles of principal designer and then designer, they're separate roles under the CDM regime, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
And the role of CDM designer is also distinct from any design role in the sense of having a contractual obligation to design. Is that correct?
It is.
Yeah. And for the Grenfell project, tRIIO was both CDM designer as well as having the primary contractual role in designing the works under the contract with Cadent, yes?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then, looking again at your first statement, now paragraph 22, you tell us there that as principal contractor this time, tRIIO had responsibility to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate the entire construction phase of the reactive and proactive works. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, moving on to consider the gas installations at Grenfell Tower itself. We asked Mr. Harrison about the 3 different gas supplies into the tower yesterday, but I just want to confirm your understanding of those. If we go to RHX 6012 at page 14, this is a figure 4 from Mr. Hancock's expert report, and it shows the 3 different gas supplies into the tower. At the bottom, we see in purple the landlord supply, which we understand feeds the boilers. Now, it's right that tRIIO had nothing to do with that gas supply, did it?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then we can see in red at the top, on the right-hand side, residential supply 1. Now, this was the original gas supply to the flats installed when Grenfell Tower was built. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we can see, if we follow the red line, that it comes into the basement and then divides into 4 risers, 1 for each of the 4 corners of the building. Do you see that?
I do. Yeah.
And again, was that your understanding at the time?
Yes.
Yes. And as it goes up, 2 of those risers split into 2. So there are in fact 6 pipes going up, 1 into each of the 6 flats on each floor. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. And if we go to page 26 within this report and look at figure 18, this is a typical floor plan at Grenfell Tower between levels 4 and 23 of the tower. And we can see in blue where the original gas riser cupboards were for this supply, for residential supply 1. Do you see those?
I do, yes.
Yes, so we can see the gas riser cupboards.
Yeah.
And is it right that that would be where the meter was and the pipes would come from there to the gas appliances, i.e. the cookers?
Yeah, so the riser would go up through the riser utility shaft into the flat, into the riser cupboard where the meter, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you. And again, did tRIIO have anything to do with the work on residential supply 1?
No.
And if we go back to page 14 and look at the figure 4 of Mr. Hancock's report, then we see in the middle of the page on the right-hand side, with the green label and the green line, something called residential gas supply 2. Now, that was the new gas supply riser that tRIIO installed in 2016 and 2017. Is that correct?
It is.
And if we follow the green line, we can see that it also comes into the basement and then comes to the southeast corner of the building. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And from there, is it right that it rises up through the building, through the stairwell, and then through into the lobbies and into the flats?
Yes.
Yes. Now, we'll come to more detail about that shortly. In terms of the background to this riser, we heard from Mr. Harrison yesterday that as part of their rolling inspection programme, Cadent surveyed the Grenfell Tower, and the surveyor identified that there was a leak between flats 22 and 32, and a Cadent team cut the entire riser that served all of the flats ending in 2 to the tower, so that the entire southeast corner was cut off from gas. Again, was that your understanding at the time tRIIO worked on the project?
Yes.
Did tRIIO have any involvement with that action, that cutting and capping?
None at all.
No. And that was done by an emergency Cadent team, wasn't
Yes.
it? Yes. Now, you mentioned earlier about that you'd get a request pro forma. I want to look at that now in the context of discussing what information was provided to tRIIO about this project. If we can go to CAD 6019. This is an email from someone called Danny Large. We can see at the bottom of the page that he worked for National Grid, then became Cadent. The email is dated the 3rd of October 2016. And if we look at the email addresses, we can see it's sent to a number of people, including tRIIO personnel. And there is an attachment. He says, please see disconnected MOB. We'll go to that in a moment. And in the red text of the email, he says, tRIIO have met with National Grid on site to confirm project scope. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, do we understand correctly from this that by the 3rd of October 2016, the time this email was sent, tRIIO had already been to Grenfell Tower and met Cadent to discuss the scope of the works that tRIIO was to perform following the cutting off of the gas supply to some of the flats?
Yes.
Yes. And just to be absolutely clear, were you any part of that meeting?
No.
No. And would tRIIO designers have attended that meeting?
I'm not sure.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. Now, you tell us in your first statement that tRIIO was instructed to carry out reinstatement works to the flats affected, and that tRIIO was not required to provide a detailed quote prior to starting the work because of their urgency. You say that in your first statement at paragraph 14. Was the usual process that tRIIO would set out a detailed quotation for Cadent to consider?
We had a schedule of rates that were agreed as part of the contractual framework agreement. So in terms of the reactive works, which this clearly was one of those projects, gas had been cut off. So we received the client brief and mobilised to site so the process can start off, and then the costing of the project and the design of the project would follow on. That would then be submitted to Cadent at a later date for approval.
Yes, I see. But I think what I'm getting at is normally would Cadent set out in a detailed quotation the work that it was proposing to do before it started work?
Not on the reactive works, no.
No, I see. So for reactive works...
Yes, it's different to the planned proactive works. Reactive works, the costing follows.
Yes, I see. So for the reactive works, you just need to get going with the work.
We do.
And then any quotation would follow up later.
Yes.
Thank you. And just to be absolutely clear, what did tRIIO understand to be the particular urgency in this case?
Gas customers or customers being without their gas supply, winter time coming.
Yes.
The welfare of the customers was clearly a priority, and therefore, hence, the urgency to get the gas, the design and construction process commenced.
Yes.
To reinstate the gas supplies.
Yes, thank you. Now I want to look now at this spreadsheet that we can see being sent in this email. If we could go to tRI 501768. And I think we need to see the PDF, the native version of this. Yes, thank you. So this is the tRIIO multi-occupancy buildings pre-design hazard information. Do you see that at the top?
Yes.
And then if we go to the second page, what we can see there is it's at the very top, it's called, if we could blow the top up, it's called a riser request pro forma. Is that a document you're familiar with?
It is, yes.
And underneath that title, there's a green box. Thank you. We're just zooming in as much as we can, but I'll read it out to you as well. So that it in that very top green box, it says this document is classed as the client brief and supports the ongoing compliance to the Construction Design and Management Regulations 2015. The information contained in this document has been prepared to the best knowledge of the client and in accordance with Regulation 4.4. And below that, we can see the date that this part of the form was completed. It was the 1st of October. We've got that there in the box, the yellow box. And the time of cut-off was 2 a.m. in the morning. And midway down the page, we can see on the left-hand side there's a heading supply material. We can see some details of the service pipes that were affected. They're said to be steel pipes, diameter of 4 inches. The riser material is steel. It's an internal riser location, etc. So we can see that there. And beneath that, we see some details about the building. It says height of the building in excess of 40 metres, category of job high-rise, number of floors 23, number of properties affected 38. And then beneath that, we see the flat numbers of the flats of customers that were believed at that time to be affected. And I think Mr. Harrison accepted yesterday that some of this may be inaccurate because some of these flats seem to end in a 1, not a 2. And it was only those ending in 2 that had their gas cut off. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And in that table, we can see in the 4th column along from the left that there's something called vulnerability identified. And there's some information in there about vulnerabilities for some of the gas users. So, for example, you can see someone is said to have young children a few lines down. And in the 7th column, in the far right column, there's also information about what appliances these residents used. Do you see that there?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Yeah. And would this information be used and referred to throughout tRIIO's works?
Yes, this is the document that's issued, as I mentioned earlier on, which is the client brief, and then this would be added to as the design and pre-construction process matures through the programming of the works.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I see. And just to confirm, was this all that tRIIO received by way of written instruction from Cadent on the work that you were to perform?
Yes, this is the initial document that's sent through.
Would you have expected more than this as an instruction to carry out such work?
This was the agreed document, so this is what we would have expected to receive, yes.
Right, okay. And going back to the first page of this document, yes, thank you. As we saw earlier, this is entitled tRIIO MOBS Multi-Occupancy Buildings Pre-Design Hazard Information. And if we go to the bottom of this page, we can see it's dated the 3rd of October 2016. Now, is it right that this was a document that tRIIO operatives would routinely fill out in order to brief tRIIO for works to be done on gas risers?
Can I just ask to go back to the top, just the top
Yes,
of the document,
of course.
please? Yes.
Yes, thank you. And in the middle of the page, in the first yellow box, I think we need to go down a bit further, there is a box for ESRI, Vulnerable Customer Information. And it's noted that a vulnerable customer is present with young children. We can see that there. And if we go to page 5 of this same document clip, we can see that some data has been gathered about crime statistics. Based on data released by local police, the area around Lancaster West has a crime rate which is much lower than the regional average. This is a safe place to live, etc. So there's some data on crime statistics. Is that something that Cadent provided to you, or that tRIIO would go and routinely gather?
We would gather this information. We would run this report to understand the environment and the location we were working and the hazard that the crime could potentially present.
Yes, I see. And then on page 7 of this same clip, there's a map of the gas supply to Grenfell Tower. We have that there. And we saw that the riser request pro forma was stated to be in accordance with the CDM regulations. And that refers to one of Cadent's duties as client under the CDM regulations, which is the duty to provide pre-construction information. You're familiar with that?
Yes, yep.
One of the experts of the inquiry, Dr. Lane, has expressed the view that this riser request pro forma was not on its own sufficient to meet the requirement of pre-construction information. Would you agree with that?
It was the initial document that was sent through, yes.
I understand it was the initial document sent through, but in terms of what you would be looking for as pre-construction information from the client, was that document alone sufficient in your view, or would that need to be supplemented?
It would need to be supplemented.
Yes, thank you. And if we can go to your first witness statement again now, the Met statement, and look at page 8 of that, and paragraph 30, you say this, you say, Cadent provided some information to tRIIO about the tower, such as the height of the tower, number of floors, number of properties and gas usage within the tower. tRIIO added to that information during the pre-construction stage of works, during which the surveyor gathered information from site by knocking on doors at the tower. The tower was owned by Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council and managed by the TMO. Now, was it typical for tRIIO to supplement the information given to it by Cadent by conducting further work on the ground, as you've described here?
Yes.
And can you help us? What sort of information would tRIIO be seeking by knocking on doors, as you've explained there?
Location of the existing infrastructure, gas infrastructure within the building, potential locations for the new meter location.
Yes.
Appliances, whether or not there were any additional information around vulnerable customers, the general layout of the property, and in the surveyor's experience, what might be of use in the design and construction of the replacement riser.
Yes. Was getting access to the flats a challenge at Grenfell Tower? Do you know?
Yes. Like all mobs, getting access to properties is not an easy task.
Yes.
So it needs to be worked out on a continual basis. It's not just a one knock and get access. It is a continual process that you need to follow.
Yes, and presumably that might be because people just simply aren't in when your engineers are going round.
That's correct. Yes.
Or would sometimes people not be happy to let gas engineers into the flat?
That could very well be the case. Yes. Yeah.
And does that mean that there might not be good or even complete data available to tRIIO when it was designing the riser?
The information was added to during the life cycle of the project. So the information that was available at the time would have informed the design, and the design wouldn't progress unless it had the appropriate information to enable it to move on to the next stage.
Yes. So just to be clear, at Grenfell Tower, you weren't ever told that the design couldn't progress because you didn't have sufficient information about the riser.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, in practice, how would the information you gathered about the riser at the tower, about, for example, people's vulnerabilities, about locations of meters, etc., all that information you're gathering, how would that be shared with the tRIIO team?
So the information in terms of, if I just talk you through the design, so in terms of being able to design the riser, we would need to know where the meter location was going to be going in the new property.
Yes.
So the information provided by the surveyor would be used to inform the design team where the new riser pipeline would need to run both vertically up the building and horizontally on each floor, so it knew where to install the access into the property.
Yes. But in practice, on the ground, how would you actually be sharing that information amongst the surveyor, the design team, or the operatives that were on site?
Yeah, so when the client brief is issued to us in tRIIO, we then commence the creation of what we call the health and safety file, and that's it would have been in our electronic system. We had a database, a repository called Nexus, whereby we would start to collect information. We were issued with an engineering bulletin from the client with regards to what the content of the health and safety should include.
Yes.
And the hierarchy of folders within the electronic system would represent the requirements of the health and safety file required by the client, and also what information we would need to use to inform the design and the construction. So it was an iterative process in terms of building that information, and the full team would have had access to Nexus. It was on the web. So that's how the information would have been shared, and by electronic forms, emails and teleconferences, etc.
Yes. And just to be clear, is that health and safety file, is that the same as a health and safety file for CDM purposes?
It is the CDM health and safety file, yes.
And would it be shared? We'll come on in a moment, just a moment actually, to look at all the different contractors and subcontractors beyond tRIIO, underneath tRIIO, who were assisting with this work. Would they also have access to the health and safety file?
Not necessarily, no. They would get that information through an operational handover.
Right. Looking back, do you think they perhaps ought to have had access to the information in the health and safety file?
That would have improved the process.
Yes, thank you. So in your first witness statement, you've helpfully set out a list of contractors and subcontractors who worked on the riser replacement at Grenfell Tower. And I just want to run through a few of them. If we go to your first statement, your MET statement at page 5, there is a table at the bottom of that, of paragraph 25 of your statement, where you say you've set out below a table of the organisations and individuals to which and to whom work was subcontracted as part of the project. And we can see in the top row, we've got K&S, and it says that they were a subcontractor to tRIIO. Now, under role, it just says senior partner, and we can see the key contact was Kenny Snell. Can you help us as to what was K&S subcontracted to do at Grenfell Tower?
K&S were subcontracted to fabricate and install the new riser and lateral system.
Yes, so they're working on the pipe itself, is that correct?
They are, yes.
The fabrication of the pipe.
The installation and the commissioning of the pipe.
Yes, thank you. And was K&S, were they well known to tRIIO?
They were, yes.
Yes. And at the next row down, second from the top, we can see London Operations Gas. And they are said to be a subcontractor to K&S, yes?
Yes.
And they were there as a surveyor, is that correct?
Yes. So
sole trader. And that was someone called Simon Boygill.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes. Sorry, you were about to say something about that.
No, I was jumping ahead there. So
No, it's fine. And what was Mr. Boygill subcontracted by K&S to do?
Simon was subcontract. He was the surveyor. So Simon visited the property and he produced the survey, which was then provided to the design team to enable the design to proceed.
Yes. And although Mr. Boygill was a subcontractor to K&S, did tRIIO have direct dealings with him on this project?
Not contractually, that was dealt with through K&S, but
Yes.
on a day-to-day basis, he would have been in constant dialogue with the design and pre-construction team.
Right, thank you. And then third row down, we can see Holland Gas Engineers Limited, again said to be a subcontractor to K&S. Under their role, it just says director, and it's Nathan Littlebury. Can you help us? What were Holland Gas Engineers contracted to do?
Holland Gas provided the gas safe engineers. They were contracted to relocate the meter, run the copper outlet pipework from the meter and reconnect back into the customer's appliances so that gas could be reinstated.
So all of their work would be inside people's flats?
It would be,
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And again, even though they were a subcontractor of K&S, did tRIIO have direct day-to-day dealings with them on the project?
Not as there would have been contact and dialogue, but not in the same way as there would have been with the surveyor. He was part of that integrated and pre-construction activity.
Yes, I see. And then the fourth row down, we can see Express Building Contractors Limited, subcontracted to tRIIO, role director, and it's Alan Monaghan is the key contact. What were they contracted to do?
Express builders we used those for the boxing in of the riser and lateral system, and any work that was required inside the flats in terms of moving boxing to enable the meters to be moved or the copper pipe work to be run.
Yes, thank you. So
Generally
that was mainly
carpentry work, yes.
Sorry. Yes, sorry, you said to be moved or the copper pipe work to be run.
Yeah, so, sorry, just to clarify, Express builders, so if Holland Gas required any internal modification inside the flat, which involved carpentry work, Express builders would have done that on their behalf, but they were contracted direct to us to do that work.
Yes, I understand. So effectively, they're mainly providing carpentry services.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, great. And then finally, at the fifth row, or this is all I want to ask you here, we've got Cape Electrical, subcontracted to tRIIO, Managing Director Phil Casateri. What were they contracted to do?
Where some of the lighting, where the lateral pipe work, for example, was run around the lobbies, to lay that pipe, electrical lights needed to be moved to enable the route of the pipe to be installed.
Yes. Did they ever move any of the light wells in the stairs? Do you remember? As well?
I don't remember.
Right.
It may have been a temporary requirement, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah. And you tell us in your witness statement that these contractors were on your approved contractors register. Can you just help us? What is that register?
Yeah, before we engage the services of any contractor, they need to fulfil certain criteria. That's known as a pre-qualification questionnaire. And that is filled in and that's then reviewed, and it satisfies that they are a company that we want to engage with, both from a financially viability perspective, but also from a health and safety capability.
Yes. And what checks would be carried out to satisfy tRIIO that from a health and safety capability perspective, this was an appropriate subcontractor to be dealing with?
So, for example, if they would have had a health and safety management system which laid out the arrangements that that company would undertake to satisfy their legal obligations from a health and safety perspective.
Yes, so tRIIO would require to see details of that health and safety management system.
Yes, that pre-qualification questionnaire would be reviewed by both our commercial team and our health and safety team.
Yes.
And that would get signed off as being suitable or not.
Yes, thank you. And did tRIIO expressly approve K&S's subcontractors? So where there's a chain below K&S, would tRIIO expressly approve those?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. There was a requirement for all contractors and subcontractors under the contract with Cadent to be approved. But on that basis, we put these individuals to work. They were inducted into tRIIO, and therefore that would suggest that they would have gone through that process. But I can't explicitly 100% give you that.
Yeah, I understand.
Yes.
I think if we look on over the page in this witness statement at page 27, we could go over the page to page 6. You start that paragraph by saying, with tRIIO's approval, KNS subcontracted parts of its work to specialist contractors. So is it right, your understanding is they would have had some approval by tRIIO before doing that?
Yes, and again, just to clarify, that is would have been a contractual requirement with Cadent that we did that. Yeah.
And were KNS's subcontractors, for example, London Operational Gas and Holland Gas, were they on tRIIO's own approved contractors register?
Yes.
Yes. Did Cadent have any role in approving tRIIO's contractors, or was this entirely a matter for tRIIO?
It was a matter for tRIIO.
Yeah.
That information would have been shared with Cadent in terms of who was on that AVO if they requested it.
Yes. And just to be clear, were these contractors and subcontractors beneath tRIIO obliged to meet the standards and guidance that we talked about earlier, including IGEM G5 and approved document B?
I'm not. So dependent upon which contractor. So Holland Gas, being a gas engineering company, would have had the requirement to satisfy the requirement of gas safe registration.
Yeah.
Simon Boygle, being a surveyor, would have been knowledgeable of G5. So in terms of discharging his duties, he would have had knowledge of G5 as well. Yes.
I understand, but I think what you were hinting at is that perhaps some of the subcontractors you might not expect to be as familiar, because, for example, they're doing carpentry work or something like that.
Express builders, Cape Electrical, non-gas related activity wouldn't need to know the industry specs.
Now, in terms of those contractors who needed to be aware of certain standards, including the IGEM standards, how in practice did tRIIO make sure that those contractors and their work met those standards?
There was an in-depth inspection and audit regime undertaken by both the contractors, our own internal inspection and audit regime, plus an audit regime undertaken by the client. So there was 3 tiers of audits that were undertaken on all works that was delivered on the tRIIO contract, and specifically the Grenfell Tower project.
Yes. And at what stage were those 3 tiers of audits carried out?
That was an ongoing process. So as soon as work commenced, there would have been inspections undertaken. It would have been recorded on, for example, our mobile platform system, and that information would have then been made available to the management team in the form of management information, and action taken if non-conformance was identified. Yeah.
Now, turning more specifically to the work that tRIIO did at Grenfell Tower, is it right that tRIIO's work was intended to be in 2 phases? First, to reinstate the gas service to the riser that was cut off after the gas leak. That's the flat 2 work, yes?
Yes.
And second, to use that design, that new riser, to eventually supply all the flats through that new riser. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And is it right that you would call the first of that work, the first replacement riser to the flat 2s, you call that reactive works? Is that right?
Yes.
And that's reactive to a cut in supply?
Yes.
And the next stage of work, connecting all the remaining flats to that new riser, you call that proactive works, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And that means proactively replacing the gas supply, is that correct?
Yes, a planned operation.
Yes. And just to be clear, was tRIIO instructed from the outset to replace the entire supply of gas to all the flats?
Yes.
So it follows, does it, that Cadent assumed at the very outset that residential supply 1 would in due course be decommissioned and replaced with whatever solution was designed and agreed by tRIIO.
That's correct, yes.
Now, if we look at your first witness statement again, actually we have it here. If we go to page 3 of this and look at paragraph 17, you tell us there, a survey and pre-construction activities were also carried out for the proposed proactive replacement of the remaining 5 risers, but construction work had not started on the other 5 risers at the time of the fire. As one of the 6 risers had leaked, it was standard practice for Cadent to take the opportunity to replace the other 5 risers in the building. And was it standard practice because there'd been a leak in this old gas pipe riser? Is that why it was standard practice to replace the others? Because in one of the risers, you've had a leak.
I'm clear I can't answer for Cadent's processes and policies. I think it's taking the opportunity, if we're installing a new riser, then we would leave the opportunity to replace the existing risers. And you know, on that assumption, due to the age of the existing risers, it would make sense to replace those. Whether that's directly related to the condition of the riser that cut off, I think that would be a question for Cadent.
Right. So you can't help as to whether there might have been any other factors that led to that decision to decide ultimately to ensure that all the flats were supplied by the new riser?
It's an ageing pipe, and therefore we've replaced one, and hence we would leave the ability to replace the others due to the age of the existing risers. That would be my my point on that.
And to be clear, was tRIIO, did they have any part in the decision as to what to do about residential supply 1, or was it just understood that the whole gas supply would eventually be replaced?
No, we had no involvement in that decision.
Yeah. Now, we know that eventually it was decided to put the new gas riser up through the stairs. Certainly that main part goes through the stairs. We'll discuss separately what happens at lower level. And I want to understand exactly how that decision came about to put the riser through the stairs at Grenfell Tower. We understand from your statements that tRIIO instructed Simon Boygill to conduct a survey, and he was assisted by 2 other people at tRIIO. Is this right? By Harvey Smith and Martin Wiskin?
Yes.
And can you help? Who was Harvey Smith?
Harvey Smith was the project manager, our operational project manager. So Harvey would have been responsible for the delivery of the installation, and Martin Wiskin was our design engineer, and Martin was responsible for the design of the new riser system.
Yeah. And was anybody else involved in considering the route that the new riser would take? For example, K&S, were they involved at all?
It would have been an integrated review, so that process of finding a solution would have been an integrated integrated process. So there would have been input. We would have taken the advice or necessary input from our experts who would have been involved in whether or not a design was a feasible, constructible solution. So it would have been an interactive process.
Yes, I follow. And to what extent did Cadent have any role in assisting with the decision about where the new riser was to go?
Can you just clarify when you say?
Yeah, I'm talking about the stairs, putting the riser in the stairs. To what extent did Cadent play any role in that decision?
The design would have been tRIIO's design, so that we would have ended up using the requirements as a hierarchy in G5, and we're looking for the least disruptive, least hazardous route. So Martin and his design team would have, with input from Simon Boygill, would have come up with a solution. That solution would have been clearly shared with the client throughout that process.
I see. Yes. And what about the TMO, the Tenant Management Organisation, who were managing the building? Do you recall whether they had any input into the decision ultimately to put the riser in the stairs?
Yeah, we were restricted. There were other options, they were discounted due to being not available to us. So, for example, putting the riser on the external facade of the building, which would have been clearly our preference, that was rejected by the TMO on the basis of the cladding, and that was rejected. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. In a moment, what I'm going to do is take you through each of the options that were considered and the reasons why they did discounted. I guess at this stage, I'm just trying to understand who would have had an involvement in that decision. And you say the TMO did have some involvement.
Yes, it was a tripartite, in effect, involvement with Cadent, the TMO, and ourselves.
Yes. Now, some of the TMO witnesses have been asked questions about this, and I just want to look at something that Mr. Madison, Peter Madison, said. He was the Director of Assets and Regeneration at the TMO. If we could go to the transcript, please, now, at day 124, day 124. I want to look at page 160. We can see at the top, he's being asked at this point about a number of complaints that had been raised about the riser going through the stairs. And at the top, we get the question, so does that tell us that, in fact, although you say you were keeping the complaint open, you were only keeping it partly open? In other words, you'd already decided to keep the pipes in the stairwell, but make sure that they were boxed in properly. And this is the answer he gives. He says this: if it was my decision, I wouldn't have had the pipes there. I would have had the gas removed from the building altogether. So it wasn't my choice. This was something that National Grid imposed, and they were inflexible around this. Said this was the only place it could go, and we had no choice really in this matter. And I just wanted to get your response to that. Do you recall there being discussions with the TMO specifically about placing the riser in the stairs?
There were. I do recall discussions around the riser going in the stairwell, and that would have been relating to the boxing in of the system.
Yes.
I don't recognise that statement there, as that wasn't something that I would have been made aware of.
Right. Yes. So you can't, from your perspective, in terms of what you were aware of, were Cadent or tRIIO acting for Cadent inflexible about the route that the riser could take?
It was the only route available to us if we was to reinstate gas back to those properties.
And was that communicated clearly to the TMO that it was the only route available?
It was after the other options had been discounted by other parties, yes.
Yes.
So are we to understand then that your designers did at least investigate the possibility or consider the possibility of putting the riser somewhere else, and that was raised with either the TMO or the council or both of them, and the message came back, you can't put it, in this case, outside the building?
Yes, there were 4 options available to us, one of which was the option that got designed. There were 3 other options, one of which was discounted. It wasn't practical, or there wasn't a engineering solution to it. The other 2 were disregarded by others, namely the TMO and Cadent.
What were those 2 options? I know one of them was to put it up the outside of the building.
The other option was to buy the gas out, so not put gas back in to the building.
So it was really 3 possibilities: buy the gas out,
Yes,
put the riser on the external facade, or put it up the stairs.
that's correct. Yeah,
And those were all raised, but 2 of them were discounted either by the TMO in the case of the external riser, or Cadent, you say, in the case of buying out.
yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yes. Now, just going through those options in a little bit more detail. So option 1, the outside of the building. Is it right, and I think you've just confirmed, that there is a preference for routing gas risers outside a building where possible?
That's correct.
And does that come from technical standard IGEM G5, which says that running the risers and all the laterals externally and then bringing them into meter points immediately on entry to the building is the most preferred gas pipe design.
It is, yes.
And just in practice, what happens with that? Do you encase the gas riser in its own external shaft outside the building? How does that work?
No, the shaft, the boxing in is required, so for ventilation purposes. And clearly, if the pipe is running external to the building, it's naturally ventilated.
Yes,
So there is no requirement to box that in,
I see.
as you described.
Yeah.
It's left should a leak occur,
So you just see a naked
you
pipe
just see a naked pipe, yes.
going up the outside of the building,
Yes.
and then penetrating each of the flats where it would then meet a meter inside those flats. Is
Yes,
that how
that's
it would,
correct. Yeah.
That's how it would work?
Yeah.
Yes. thank you.
Sorry to interrupt again, but maybe I don't understand exactly how this would work. But do the planners not have any view about the appearance of an external pipe of some kind or another, unboxed in, unprotected?
Yes, it can be a challenge. The aesthetic impact, if that's a way to describe it, of a pipe going on the outside of a building is not always welcome.
What sort of pipe would it be?
It would be steel pipe, generally speaking, 2-inch in diameter, dependent upon the number of customers that it would need to supply.
Yeah.
It'd be steel pipe painted black.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and can you help us? How serious was the consideration given at Grenfell Tower to that option?
It was our preferred option.
Yes.
So it was the preferred option. It would have been the number one option available to us. When that was discounted, or we were told that we couldn't do that, then we looked at the buyout option. That wasn't possible, and then we were left with finding a viable route, and that was the route that was available to us, the only route that was available to us after those two other options had been discounted.
Yes, and I think you tell us in your witness statement that the reason it was discounted is because it would penetrate the new cladding and would have rendered the cladding guarantee null and void. Is that correct?
It is, yeah, that's my understanding, yes.
And also for aesthetic reasons, they didn't want the new cladding being penetrated by gas pipes. Is that
Yes.
correct? And that was something the TMO communicated to you. Is that
It
correct?
was, yeah, not me personally, but to the
Yes,
designers.
to the team. Yes. So there were discussions with the TMO, were there, over this option?
Yes.
Right. And were those verbal discussions? Because we haven't been able to find any documents that detail these discussions.
I don't know.
Okay.
I can't, not 100% sure.
And would it be fair to say that it was decided quite quickly that the riser would have to be reinstated, if it was going to be reinstated, through the interior of the building?
Yes, after we had discounted those two options, to be able to comply with the requirements of G5, that was the route that was taken.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I was just going to quickly run through a couple of other options,
Yeah, well,
but equally I can stop there because they're slightly discrete little topics.
what would you prefer to do?
Let's stop now. I'm making good progress.
Good.
And I'll carry on with the other options when we pick up after the break.
Right, thank you. Well, Mr. Dolan, as I think we warned you, we have a break during each session. This seems to be a good time to take a break now, so we'll stop and resume at 11:30. And I have to ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it during the break.
Yeah,
All right?
of course.
Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you. 11:30.
Thank you.
Would you ask Mr. Dolan to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Dolan, ready
Yes.
to carry on?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we were in the middle of discussing the different options for the replacement riser and how it came about that that riser ended up in the stairs. And we've already just discussed the fact that there was a proposal to put it on the outside the building, but you explained that that was not satisfactory for the TMO, and so you had to look inside the building for the riser. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Now, now I want to just discuss the option of running it through residential supply 1, so running it through the existing position of the riser that had been cut off. Now, as we understand it, is this right? The existing gas supply ran from the basement up through the building and into the flats at the kitchens, so it was actually going internal to the flats
Yes.
as it penetrated the building.
Yes, my understanding, in through the basement, up into a riser cupboard and then into a flat, and then it would have progressed through the building, through the flats,
Yeah.
to the very top.
Yeah. And if we look at your first statement again, your Met statement, page 8, paragraph 31, you tell us there the existing network could not be repaired due to the leakage being within the fabric of the building, i.e. embedded in the concrete between flats. If we could have visually inspected the gas riser, it may have been possible to refurbish the existing pipe. So, was any consideration actually given to the possibility of simply repairing the cut riser?
So there is a process that, subject to being able to inspect the pipe in its entirety, and then possibly to put what you call a test on it, it would have been possible to reconnect it. But because we couldn't visibly inspect the pipe, there was no option to use that. That option was not available to us.
Yeah. And is it right that you couldn't visibly inspect it really for 2 reasons? One, because it was going up between people's flats, so there was the problem of access. And 2, because it was going between concrete floors,
Yes,
through concrete floors,
Yes,
which made
embedded.
inspection difficult. Is that a fair summary of the problems?
It is, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I think you ought just to explain what you were trying to say. Is embedded in the
fabric of the building.
In the concrete.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and what is the problem with pipes being embedded in concrete? Can you just explain?
In the context of being able to reconnect it and use it,
Yes.
not being able to visibly inspect it.
Right. Yes. And it's right, isn't it, that there weren't any sleeves through around the original pipework, so the pipe was just directly concreted in to the floors. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yes. And the next option I just want to ask you about is running it through the utilities shaft. We know that there were already some shafts for utilities running vertically through Grenfell Tower for water, for example. And in particular, there's a utilities shaft in a cupboard by the stairs opposite the lifts. I don't know whether you recall that.
Yeah, there are 2 from the basement. There is a utility cupboard utility cupboard on what we would consider the first floor. A second utility cupboard above that would then go into the flat above, and then the riser would proceed up through the flats. So whilst we could have got a pipe into the basement and into the first 2 riser cupboards, you couldn't go up into the flats because you'd have to get in the flats and run the pipeline within the flats.
Yes.
So that was not available to us.
Yes. What about going up through those utilities cupboards and then going into the utilities cupboards that go through the lobbies at Grenfell Tower at levels 4 to 23?
So the question was asked through dialogue with the TMO around using the existing ceilings to run the lateral pipes. That was discounted. Their contractor advised against that in terms of room and being unventilated.
Right. I see. So I think what you're saying is that the ceilings in those utilities cupboards wouldn't have been appropriate for running your laterals off it?
Yes, that was
right?
my understanding at the time of the discussions between the design team and the TMO.
Yeah. And you're saying there was a potential problem with ventilation in that utilities shaft, is that correct?
In the full ceilings, the suspended ceilings, that's my understanding, yes.
Right. And was this ever a serious option that was looked at Grenfell Tower, doing it this way?
It was looked at, yes, and I have seen email traffic between ourselves and the TMO where that option was discussed.
Right. Now let's look at the route that was actually chosen. If we could go to tRIIO 7044, this is an email from Mr. Boygill, the surveyor, on the 12th of October 2016, and he's copying in, he's sending this to various tRIIO personnel, and you can see that he says in the main paragraph, so after hello Harvey, he says, as discussed, I've identified a route up through the block to the top floor. This pipe would eventually supply the remainder of the block. Security valves can be left. The riser can be installed in the stairwell close to the affected flats. The main issue is the recently installed mechanical air vents circulating the air on all communal landings. And then he says, at this stage, I haven't contacted the council whilst investigation's still ongoing. And he says that the council contact is Charlie Saul at the TMO, and we'll see his name in some other exchanges. And Mr. Boygill attaches some marked up photographs to that email, and we can see the route that was proposed, and we'll do that in a moment. Can you help us where he says at the end of that first paragraph, the main issue is the recently installed mechanical air vents circulating the air on all communal landings? Can you help us as to what he means by that?
Yeah, the issue he's referring to is to being able to ventilate, so the gas pipe that would have run in this, what he's talking about here, running from the stairwell into each communal landing, that communal landing had mechanical ventilation fitted, and there are two issues with mechanical ventilation. One, there is a source of ignition, which is a problem, obviously, if there's gases escaping from a leak on the pipe. And also, should that mechanical ventilation break down, therefore there is no ventilation, and therefore it's not suitable. Mechanical ventilation isn't suitable for providing the ventilation requirements as specified by G5 for gas pipes in that location.
Yes, because it's right, isn't it, that ideally, well, the recommendation is that you have natural ventilation around a gas pipe. Is that correct?
It is natural ventilation, indirect and direct ventilation, dependent upon the construction used.
Yes, thank you. Let's look then at the marked up photographs showing the route that he was proposing. If we can go to CAD 6054. And if we look at page 4 of this clip, here we can see a marked up map showing the gas services coming in from the east, which is where the other two services come in from. So he's sending that, and you can see he's marking a new supply onto this map, I think in the yellow arrows. If we then go to page 9, we can see a photograph. This is a photograph of the east side of the tower at ground level. And what Mr. Boygill's done is marked up the 3 services coming in. And is it right that the new service was the 4-inch service at the right of this picture? Is that correct? We can see there's a 10-inch service going in to the left.
The 4-inch and the 10-inch are the existing supplies.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a mistake in our notes.
Yeah.
Sorry. So is this just showing you what the existing services are that are going in?
Yes, so
I see.
the 10-inch and the 4-inch, the 10-inch is to the boiler,
Yes.
landlord supply, and the 4-inch was to the existing
Thank
6 risers.
Yes, thank you. If we go to page 10, we can see, is this right, with these yellow lines, he's showing how the service would come into the basement at around 5 metres high. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Yeah. And then page 12 shows us how it would come into the basement and then up through the ceiling of the basement. Is that correct?
It is, yeah.
Page 13, then, and this is where you were talking about service riser cupboards. We can see that he's suggesting that it's going, this is at ground and first floor level. It would go through this service cupboard, is that correct?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. And then at page 14, the next page, we can see how the riser would go through the main entrance lobby at Grenfell. Do you have that?
I do.
And again, that's the yellow dotted line, yes?
Yeah.
At page 15, we see floor 2. This is the second floor, so it's coming through the floor of the stairs, having gone through that atrium, and then it's rising into the stairs and starting to travel through the stair shaft. Is that correct?
Yes. On the previous picture, the riser that we installed.
Yes, let's go back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we go back one picture. Yes, do you want to explain?
That riser through the 2 floors before it entered into the stairwell, as you just seen, they were the riser cupboards. So there was a riser cupboard as it came out of the basement, there's a riser cupboard with a louvered door. Then there was a similar scenario set up above that where it went into, and then it went into a storeroom, and then it went into the stairwell.
Yes,
Yeah.
I see. Yes, so it's not actually going.
It doesn't actually go
through
there, no.
the lobby like this. It's going behind where we're seeing.
Yeah.
Through a series of cupboards and other riser cupboards.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And then if we go to page 16, we can see, yes, that he's explaining how it would go up through the stairs. And you can see at the top that it would go through the ceilings of the stairs. And he's also starting to show how lateral pipes would branch off to start to serve each floor. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
And if we look at page 17 now, this shows the view from the communal lobby at levels 4 to 23. And is it right that the pipe comes in through the left and then snakes round the top of the wall, under the ceiling, and then across to the flat? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And then just a few pictures to show how the riser was actually built, because this also helps to explain the position that it went into. If we could go to CAD 401640. This is a picture of the riser on floor 4 in the stairs. And it's gone through the floor at the bottom and it goes through the top, and then it's branching off and then going through the wall into the lobby. Is that correct, on the other side?
Yes, that's correct.
And if we could go to another picture, sorry, tRIIO 501431. Sorry, if we just rotate that picture. Now we can see the as-built picture with this is the pipe work. So what we haven't got, and we'll come to it later, is the boxing in at this point. But am I right that this is how the pipe itself was built, coming out of the stairs at the wall to the left, and again passing round the ceiling or just underneath the ceiling, and then down and through to the flat 2s. Is that correct?
It is.
And it wasn't all flat 2s, was it? It was only some of them who needed gas.
13 of the 20 flats needed gas.
Yes, thank you. So that was the proposal. And then we know that there was a second survey by Mr. Boygle. If we can go to that, this is at CAD 6038. This is an email that he sends on the 1st of November 2016, again to tRIIO and a number of its subcontractors. And he says, "Morning, Harvey. As requested, I've had another look at the landings to avoid running any pipework within the heating pipe boxing." And he gives a number of measurements that he's carried out. And then if we go down to where he's got a heading, gas meter resites, he says this: "All flats have an area of between 1 metres and 4 metres that back onto the communal landings, which can be drilled through for new gas meter positions. There are a variety of cupboards to relocate the meter into." Now, just to be clear, was it necessary to move the gas meters within flats to be closer to where the pipework entered the flats?
Yeah, there are restrictions on the length of pipe that can be run inside a residential property. That length is 2 metres. So to get back to the original meter locations, we would have had to have laid or installed pipe at a greater length to 2 metres. We'd have introduced fittings. That isn't allowed under the specifications that we work to. So we had to look for a location for the meter to be relocated that was within that 2 metre maximum length.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's helpful. So they're effectively within 2 metres of the front door.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. So they're moved, just to be clear, from the kitchen cupboards to being by the front door. Is that correct?
There is a room next, so as you come through the front door, there is a hallway, and there is a room next to that hallway, and that's where the meter was relocated.
Yes. And I'll take you to some pictures of that in due course. We'll have a look at that. Now, Simon Boygill attaches some more marked up photographs to this second survey, and these illustrate how he proposed the proactive works to be installed, i.e. this was the works later to extend the riser to serve more flats. If we just have a look at that, this is within the same document, page 4 of this same document. And is it right that the pink arrows going to the left here are showing how the riser would be extended in that direction in the stairs? Is that correct?
I'm not sure with that photo. If that was the extension of the riser in the stairwell to get to a pipe to lay into a separate floor.
Right. You're not entirely
No,
sure.
my understanding from my recollection was that we would branch off of the pipe on the green with the yellow into the the communal landings.
So
and
you
the
go
pipe,
off to the right and then to all of the landings. I see. So you can't help us with what he's showing in the pink.
I can only I'm not 100% sure. I can make a sort of a engineering judgment on it, but
we think that the pink arrows might be to go to the flats ending in 1. Is that possible?
it could be.
That for the flat 1s it goes that way, and for all the other flats it goes
That
to
could
the
very
right.
well be, yes.
Right, thank you. And if we go to page 8 of this clip, we can see with the pink arrows, he's showing how the riser would be extended within the lobbies to service other flats. Is that correct?
That is right, yes.
Those are the laterals branching into each of the flats.
Yeah.
And then at page 11, we can also see something similar being shown. Yes, and there you can see another view of that. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, would the tRIIO designers have received all this information from Mr. Boygill following his surveys?
Yes, we would have understood the number of flats on each floor, the gas loading requirements of each customer, and they would have used that information to design the size of the pipe required to satisfy that gas requirement.
Yes. Now, would they have examined this proposed route for themselves? I'm looking to explore the extent to which they would have just taken what Mr. Boygill said in his survey, or would they have separately asked themselves the question whether that was a sensible route?
They would have asked the question, yes. They would have asked for alternative routes. Whether or not Simon could find an alternative route, I'm not sure. That's the survey information that we received. It enabled the designers to extend the reactive works to the flats that would have been part of the planned proactive works.
Right. And thinking about both surveys that Mr. Boygill did, the first one showing the route of the new riser and the second showing more about the proactive works, would the tRIIO, was it the responsibility of the tRIIO designers to evaluate the safety and compliance of those routes themselves?
It was, yes.
Right. So they couldn't just rely on Mr. Boygill's surveying work. They had to ask themselves separately whether it was a safe and compliant route to follow. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Now, let's look at the first design. I'm going to call it replacement design number 1. If we can go to tRIIO 60263. So this is a drawing, and it's also got some little inserts, including with the map, of the first design that was come up with for this work. And on the left-hand side, in the third box down, we get the date. It's dated the 11th of November 2016, so that's very small writing.
That's better, yeah.
That's better, yes. You can see the user ID, Ashley Johnson. Who was Ashley Johnson?
Ashley was a design analyst.
Yeah.
Or is a design analyst.
Yeah. And the date is the 11th of November 2016. And it says in the bottom third of the page, bottom text in the left-hand column, it tells us that this project has been, right at the bottom there, this project has been designed in accordance with IGEM G5 and tPRML4. What was tPRML4?
That is cadence main laying procedure. So any gas pipe, it relates to the in-ground pipe. So the in-ground pipe would have been designed to ML4 requirements and the riser system to G5.
Yeah. And at the very bottom of this page, we can see a web address, a URL for this document. There we go, right at the bottom. And there's reference there to something called Gasworks 9. Now, you tell us in your first statement that the project was designed using this software. Is that correct?
Yeah, in terms of design, Gasworks 9 would be used to size the riser system. So it would take the length of the pipe required, it would take the gas usage required, and it would use those two component parts to determine the size of the pipe required for that particular building.
Yes.
So in the context of the design, that's what that means.
Yes,
Yeah.
I see. And that's, just to be clear, that's gas modelling software, is that correct?
Yeah, it's it models using hydraulically analysis.
Yes. And does it model pressure drop, velocity, gas demand, size of pipe?
It does, yes.
Yes. And just to be clear, it doesn't assist with considering other technical compliance issues like ventilation or compartmentation breaches, does it?
No, it doesn't, no.
So if we look at the drawing itself, we can see at the bottom there, we've got that little red dotted line. Is that the gas main into the building?
That would be the inlet pipe, the 90 mil.
And a new service pipe had to be built underground for this supply, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah. And the red bow-shaped symbol, is that an isolation valve?
Yeah, that's a pipeline isolation valve known as a PIV.
PIV, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then the dark green pipe goes through the basement and up, and we can see a little blue symbol then at each floor. Perhaps if we can now pan out of the drawing and see. Now, that little blue symbol at each floor, does that indicate that the valve that was there when the proactive design was going to be put in?
It's very difficult to say on this drawing. I just want to clarify that would be to extend the proactive works.
Right. Yes. And then on each floor, we can see a yellow pipe that's coming out and is going round through the stairs into the lobby and round the outside of the lobby. Is that right? That's showing the laterals.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And then the bright green box on each floor, is that where it enters each individual flat?
That's on this particular drawing. This is entering the flats ending in 2.
Yes. Yes. Just to be clear, that this is this is the design for the first phase of your work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we can see the drawing finishes at the top with the laterals on floor 23. And is it right that the intention was the pipes would finish at floor 23 and then take advantage of the natural ventilation provided by the roof vent?
Yes, that's right.
Now, just looking at the little inset drawing in the middle of the page, if we could blow that up. The drawing, that's it, thank you. So this is headed internal lateral pipe work requires boxing in on each floor as below. So it's showing us the boxing in plan. And as we understand it, is it right that the dark green pipe on the left, that's the riser coming up through the stairs? Yes?
Yes, yeah.
The yellow pipes are the laterals that then go through the stair wall and into people's flats? Yes?
Yes.
And the hard black line around some of those laterals shows the boxing in. Now, is it right, and this is important, is it right that in this particular design, the boxing in is only on the communal lobby side where the pipes were to be boxed in completely?
Yes, so as the pipe went through the wall from the stairwell into the communal lobby,
Yeah.
on that side of the wall in the communal lobby, the extent of the pipe in the lobby would have been boxed in.
Yeah. So once it's in the lobby, it's got its own little compartment around it. But when it's in the stairs, according to this first design, the pipe was going to be naked. Is that correct?
Yes, it would be it's segregated from this is for ventilation purposes because of the mechanical ventilation that I referenced earlier.
Yes.
So we segregated this pipe from the lobbies where the mechanical ventilation was, and it in effect become part of the stairwell. It was open-ended into the stairwell.
Yes, thank you. And so there'd be oversized holes, wouldn't there, around the pipe as it goes into the lobby?
That's right, yes.
To allow a free flow of ventilation from the boxing in back into the stairwell? Yeah?
Yes, correct.
And the stairwell itself would be this is the intention, to provide the natural ventilation to the riser itself, yes?
Yeah, so for design 1, there was ventilation at roof level.
Yes.
And I think it's important to note that the pipe in the stairwell in design 1 was a welded system.
Yes.
So direct ventilation was available at the roof vent, and at the bottom of the stairwell we had indirect ventilation, which was the door movement, air movement resulting from the door into the stairwell. So we had indirect ventilation at the bottom of the stairwell and direct ventilation at the top.
Right.
And that was the design that was produced in design 1.
And then the red text at the bottom of this inset drawing, it says boxing to be open-ended into the communal stairwell to allow ventilation of the lateral pipework. That's what we were just discussing, yeah.
That is it, yes.
Yeah. Yes. And just to visualise the hole around the pipe through the stairwell and into the lobby, if we can just look at a picture, CAD 401653. This is a photograph on the stair side of the lateral on the stair side going through the wall into the lobby, and there we can clearly see the oversized hole. Is that correct?
That is that, yeah.
Yeah, and it's there for ventilation purposes.
It's there to vent, yes, for the laterals, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this design did require the compartment between the stair and the lobbies to be breached to ensure that the gas pipes could be ventilated. That's right, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Now, can we look at the design risk register now that tRIIO completed in relation to this design? That's at tRI 60369. At the top, we can see this is called a CDM Design Risk Register. And in the box underneath that, we can see it's dated the 15th of November 2016. And beneath that, there is a box, or two below that, we can see the designer's name, Ashley Johnson, and just below that, it says Project RAG status based on residual risk score. Now, can you just help us with what does RAG, R-A-G, stand for?
So it determines, very simply in terms of RAG is red, amber, green. Red being higher risk than amber, amber being higher risk than green.
Yes. And then we can see below that, highlighted in green, we can see the score for this, under this assessment, is 17. Yes, is that right?
Yeah.
And the significance of that can be seen by looking at the key beneath that, because what it says in the key beneath that is if it's less than 18, it's very tiny text. I don't know whether we can make it any better. So in the smaller little green rectangle, it says if it's less than 18, the wording says issue to ops, no hazard, op handover meeting required. And then in red, what it says is if it's greater than 18, greater than or equal to 18, full DRA required. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
Yeah. And what does a full DRA mean?
So a DRA stands for a design risk assessment.
Yeah.
It may help if I explain the process. So,
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so the design team within tRIIO designed MOBS projects, but it also designed mains replacement projects and various other activities that were required under the contract. Every project went through the design risk register process, and it was those projects that were deemed to have a higher level of risk after going through that process whereby a more detailed design risk assessment would be undertaken.
Yes.
In this instance, for Design 1, the risk was felt at that time it was sufficiently low enough not to require a design risk assessment.
Yes, thank you. Yes. And so because the score came to 17 in this instance, there was no need to consider any further risks in this design. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And if we go to the bottom of the page, we can also see a box right at the bottom that says manual DRA override needed, ? Do you see that?
Yes.
What does that mean?
So the design risk register requires information to be input and a score is generated from the actual system itself. Now, if the designer at that point, if that, for example, comes out at 10, but the designer feels that in this instance a design risk assessment is required, he can override that and go to the full design risk assessment.
Yes. So it's a human being.
Yes.
Countenancing what's happened with the system.
There's a security.
Yeah.
Look at it as a security
Yeah.
level in effect.
And in this case, it looks like the designer did not manually override the process and go on and do a full design risk assessment. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Yeah. Let's just have a quick look to see what would have been considered had that DRA process been triggered. Yeah. If we can go to tRIIO 50218. This is the design risk assessment, which was conducted later in March 2017. We're going to come to that in due course and see that there was a second design risk assessment process. But just for the moment, I want to see what would have been considered, the questions that would have had to be considered if this DRA process had been triggered. If we can go to page 4 of this document. And towards the bottom of the table, sorry, again, it's very tiny writing. If we could blow up the bottom, items 19, 20 and 21, what we get is in the header in blue, it says MOBs, specific hazards. So as I understand it, these are specific hazards which might arise in multi-occupancy buildings. Is that correct?
Yes.
And beneath that, we've got 3 items that are asked to be considered. That's better. Thank you very much. We can see 19 is breach of fire compartments. 20, failure mode expansion, south-facing pipework and thermal expansion. So that's about expansion of pipework. And 21 is inadequate ventilation. Do you see those three matters there?
Yes.
So it's right that those three items are only considered if there is a design risk assessment process. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
So unless someone's manually overridden it, or unless the score is high enough, these questions are not asked at the design risk assessment process. Is that correct?
Yes, they're not. They wouldn't have been in this instance.
Yes. Now, can we agree that replacing the gas supply to Grenfell Tower did involve breaching of fire compartments?
It did, yes.
And pretty important fire compartments, weren't they?
Yes.
As in the stairs, a single stair, yes?
Yes.
And through to the communal lobbies
Yes.
for flats. And it also involved, can we agree this, a complex ventilation strategy?
Yes.
And so can we take it from this that the tRIIO designer did not specifically consider these features in any detail when the initial design was created?
They considered the breach of the fire compartments in terms of boxing in. The boxing in was fire rated, but it wasn't part of the design risk assessment process. It wasn't formally documented under this process. That's correct.
Can you help us as to why not? Why, given what you've just accepted, that this was breaching important fire compartments, it was a complex ventilation strategy, can you account for why a tRIIO designer didn't manually override so that those specific risks were considered?
I can't provide an explanation as to why the designer at that point did not manually override that design risk register.
Looking back on this now, do you agree that those features, breach of compartmentation, ventilation, should have been the subject of a detailed design risk assessment?
I do, yes.
Yeah. But the way that the design assessment process was carried out, the overall score meant that these risks were not considered in any detail. That's right, isn't it?
Not part of that process, yes.
Yeah. Doesn't that indicate that this design risk assessment process was flawed?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It was weak.
Yes, thank you. Now, if we can go, you tell us in your first statement at page 10, I don't think we need to pull it up, paragraph 39, you tell us that the design was prepared by tRIIO designers and was approved by a tRIIO design engineer. Can you help us? What was the process for design review and final approval?
Yeah, in tRIIO we have something called a design management plan, and it's a document that sets out the arrangements of how we manage design across the various work streams under this contract or under that contract. And within that design management plan is the arrangements for reviewing and approving designs before it finds its way into the as an approved document, as an approved design. So in Grenfell Tower, the design was produced by, as you can see, Ashley Johnson. It would have been approved by our design engineer. Design 1 would have been approved by Martin Wiskin, a design engineer.
Right, yeah. Now, I just want to focus now on some other particular design principles and the consideration given by tRIIO and others to these in the design. So as we've seen, the design required the riser to go through the stairwell for most of its part. Can we just look at approved document B now? So this is at CLG 50224, and I want to look at page 53. We can see on the right-hand column, there's a paragraph 440, and the heading to that is gas service pipes in protected stairways. Do you have that?
Yes, I do, yes.
And we can see what it says. It says gas service and installation pipes or associated meters should not be incorporated within a protected stairway unless the gas installation is in accordance with the requirements for the installation and connection set out in the Pipeline Safety Regulations 1996 and the Gas Safety Installation and Use Regulations 1998. So in other words, is it right that this appears to say that you can build a gas riser in a protected stair, but it has to meet other technical requirements of a gas riser in those other regulations.
That's what that says, yes.
Were you aware of this provision within Approved Document B at the time?
I wasn't personally.
No. Would you expect you mentioned before that you wouldn't have expected your designers to have been particularly familiar with Approved Document B?
No, they wouldn't have been. They would have been using IGM G5 as the main document in producing that design, on the understanding that by complying with G5, these other regulations that relate to the work would have been satisfied.
Yes. So does it follow that you wouldn't have expected the tRIIO designers to have been aware of this particular part of Approved Document B?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Would you expect a tRIIO designer to know the difference between a protected stair and a firefighting stair?
Not necessarily.
As far as you are aware, was there any further consideration about whether putting the riser in the stair was acceptable? For example, did tRIIO consider asking the TMO to check with the London Fire Brigade if that was acceptable?
We didn't specifically ask that it's checked with the London Fire Brigade, but the design was sent through to the TMO, and the TMO approved that design.
Right.
They approved the commencements of the projects, and there was dialogue, email traffic between our design team and the TMO with regards to the design and whether or not it would be acceptable from the TMO's perspective.
Right. But you didn't specifically flag that you would suggest that the London Fire Brigade should be consulted over this?
Not the London Fire Brigade, but there was email dialogue or traffic around checking or confirming the fire requirements of the building.
Right. What about flagging that it ought to be checked with the fire risk assessor that was being used by the TMO to check that they were content with it being in that location?
I can't recall personally whether or not that question was asked in terms of specifically with our fire risk assessor, although I do know that the fire risk assessor reviewed the works and the design.
Yes. Can we look at another part of Approved Document B now, at page 116? This is diagram 52 that sets out various components of a firefighting shaft. And this is in the B5 section of Approved Document B, which, to help you, that deals with access and facilities for firefighters in buildings. So this is diagram 52, and at the very bottom, we can see in the notes at point 4, it says this diagram is only to illustrate the basic components and is not meant to represent the only acceptable layout. The shaft should be constructed generally in accordance with clauses 7 and 8 of BS 5588 from 2004. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, I think it follows from your earlier answers that you wouldn't have expected the tRIIO designers to have been aware of this part of Approved Document B on firefighting shafts.
That's correct.
Yeah. If we can go to that British standard, BS 5588, it's at BSI 6087. We can see the title is Fire Precautions in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Part 5, Access and Facilities for Firefighting. And then if we go within it to page 23, actually, this section, just so you can see it, it starts on page 22. If we go back one page, yes, there's a section here, section 7.1.4, layout of firefighting shafts. And then if we go over the page within this section and look at the third paragraph down, we can see it says this. It says, goods lifts and service lifts should not be located within firefighting shafts. Only services associated with the firefighting shaft should pass through or be contained within the firefighting shaft. A firefighting shaft should not contain any cupboards or provide access to service shafts serving the remainder of the building. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, can we agree, just looking at that now, that the practical effect of that is that if the stairwell at Grenfell Tower was a firefighting shaft, then there should not have been a gas riser in it?
In terms of, yes, in this document, yes.
In 2016, is that something that tRIIO and its designers understood?
No.
No, thank you. I just want to focus now on some of the ventilation aspects of the first design. If we can go back to approved document B, this is CLG 50224, and look now at page 81. This is within the B3 section, which is about internal fire spread, and it includes provisions about compartmentation. And paragraph 8.41, we can see, is talking about their ventilation of protected shafts conveying gas. And we can see it says this: a protected shaft conveying piped flammable gas should be adequately ventilated direct to the outside air by ventilation openings at high and low level in the shaft. Any extension of the story floor into the shaft should not compromise the free movement of air over the entire length of the shaft. Guidance on such shafts, including sizing of the ventilation openings, is given, and then there's another British standard, BS 8313 from 1997. Now, can we agree in simple terms a gas supply needs to be adequately ventilated at the top and at the bottom of the shaft?
Yes.
And you've already mentioned that it really needs to ventilate naturally. There are all sorts of problems with mechanical ventilation.
Yeah, there's a difference between there's mechanical ventilation, direct, and then there's indirect ventilation. In the context of the riser that was put in the stairwell, design one was a welded system, and G5, which was the spec that the designers used to design that riser system, ensured that there was direct or indirect ventilation at the top of the bottom.
Yeah.
The top direct ventilation through the roof vent, and at the bottom there was a door onto the atrium level. There's a door going onto a landing that goes onto the atrium, and then there's the front doors, and it's the door movements, air movement over 30 minutes, which would have satisfied the indirect ventilation at the bottom. That's how the design was produced.
Yeah.
Yes.
But is it right that that would have to rely upon the riser being welded steel?
Absolutely, yes, correct.
Yeah. Now, looking at that paragraph 8.41, again, just to be clear, I think from what you've said, you wouldn't have expected the tRIIO designers to have known about that provision at the time they were designing the Grenfell Tower riser.
That's correct.
Yeah. If we can go to CAD 6035 now. These are some notes of something called the MOB's performance call, dated the 25th of October 2016. Can you can see that in the subject of this email, and what we're going to get is a whole list, I think, of buildings. Can you just explain what this MOB's performance call was?
There was a twice daily call between the client, Cadent, and the tRIIO operational team, and that twice daily call was looking at gas off. So where gas risers had been disconnected due to a gas escape, how long would it take to get the gas back onto those customers? So it was a performance meeting held by the client where we would be asked the question as to what was still off, what was on, how long was it going to take to get it on. And that was a twice daily call that was held.
Yes, thank you. Now, if we look on page 2 of this document, at the top of the page, we can see the record of the discussions that were held about Grenfell Tower. And we can see about halfway down that entry, on the 11th of October 2016, it says, potential buyout, awaiting confirmation in hand. And then do you see below that, it says, route that was identified doesn't have ventilation. Buyout for whole building. Can you see those words in those notes?
Yep. Yes, I can.
Can you just help us as to what was being discussed based on those notes?
I can't comment on the actual call.
Right.
I wasn't involved involved in that. It appears to be a discussion around the survey, what was identified from the survey as a potential route, and the thinking at that time as to whether or not that was a viable option.
Yeah.
Hence, can we go down the buyout route and not put gas back into the building?
Yes.
And, in terms of what you presented there, I think that's what I would take from that.
Yes. And in terms of the words where it says route that was identified doesn't have ventilation, does that trigger a memory in terms of what the problem was about ventilation that was being discussed at this point?
I wasn't involved with that.
Right.
That's cool, so I can't.
Right. So you can't help about whether that was the problem of mechanical ventilation being in the communal lobby?
It could very well be, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now, we saw that in Simon Boyle's initial survey of the 12th of October 2016, there was no express reference to a ventilation strategy in that. But if we go back to his second survey that he did in November 16, this is at CAD 6038. At the bottom of that page, this is the email that he sent. We can see there's also a heading ventilation/G5. And would you understand that G5 to be a reference to the IGEM G5 technical standard?
It is, yes.
Yeah. And he says this: once the pipework is installed, the riser system could be segregated from the mechanical air extraction by being boxed in. There is a route out to fresh air through the basement and would assume a route out through the top floor, no access to roof as locked. Now, was it acceptable in your view for the tRIIO designers to have relied on that statement by Simon Boyle as having given sufficient consideration to the ventilation question for the pipework?
No, it's the designer's responsibility to produce the design and the ventilation requirements.
So is it right that you would have expected them, the tRIIO designers, to have given separate consideration to the ventilation aspects of this new riser design?
Yes.
Do you know if they did, in fact, give separate consideration to those ventilation aspects?
In terms of the design one, they would have done in terms of what the resultant design was around. I just explained that earlier on in terms of roof access and the door movement. So he talks about there, Simon, a route to the basement. The design one required on the door movement at the bottom of the stairwell, going into the atrium level to the front door, which is what the designers ended up with.
Yeah.
So while Simon has mentioned the basement there, in terms of that iterative process of producing the design, it was the indirect ventilation that was available or was part of the end design that the designers produced.
Yes. Now, we have not seen any evidence, any written evidence, that tRIIO gave more consideration to ventilation, and in particular to the ventilation in the route between the basement and the stairs. Can you help us as to why we don't see that in any of the design documentation?
It wasn't. I don't think that anything that wasn't documented in terms of the decision, the thought process that they went through.
So when you say, I don't think that anything that wasn't documented in terms of their thought processes, do you mean that you would have you understand all their thought processes to have been documented as they progress with the design?
Yes, in terms of the iterative process of ending up with the final design, documenting the process that they would have gone through to end up with that final solution.
Yes. So are you saying it was done but not documented?
Yes, I know it was done because in terms of the final design, in terms of the ventilation requirements of it, but I haven't seen any documented. I haven't seen that documented.
Yes. We've also not seen any documentation relating to the ventilation at the bottom of the stairs where the riser comes into the stairwell. Again, can you help us as to why we don't see any documentation dealing with that at the design stage?
I can't. If it's not documented, then we won't have had it in terms of written down.
Yeah. We also can't find any documentation relating to the very top of the building. There was, as far as we can tell, there was no design actually completed for how it was going to vent at the top. Is that your understanding?
Yes, right.
Yeah. And that should have happened, shouldn't it?
In terms of design, in confirming the ventilation requirements, yes, calculations to confirm that the ventilation in the design was satisfied. Yes, there was no documented design inclusive of calculations.
Yes. The inquiry's expert is critical of the fact that there isn't a detailed design or description as to how, go back to the bottom of the building, as to how the pipe between the basement and the stairs was going to be ventilated as it passed through each of those spaces. Do you accept that criticism?
Yes, I do. In terms of design one, information was conveyed between the designers and the operation team in terms of what should happen, but it wasn't documented. There is no documented evidence to support that.
He's also not seen any reference to the need for vents conforming to the relevant British standards, that's BS 8313 or Table 7 of IGEM G5, in these spaces between the basement and the stairs. Again, do you accept that there should have been vents between those locations?
The general approach, so design one, the general approach to design is to fill in holes once they've been breached, unless required for ventilation purposes. So in design one, all holes were to be filled, other than the holes that went from the lobby into the basements. Sorry, the lobby into the stairwell.
Yes.
So all holes that were drilled were to be filled in design one. That changed for design two.
Yes. I'll come back to that later. Yeah. That's what's happening at levels 4 to 23 of the tower. I'm focusing about what happens between the basement and the lower part of the stairs. We've not seen any reference to the need for vents in that lower portion of the pipe. And the suggestion is that that is in breach of the British standard and in breach of IGEM 5. Do you accept that?
Maybe I can explain, that will help. In the basement, so if you look at the basement as a separate compartment, there was a plant door room, and therefore it was, in terms of the design, that plant room door would provide the natural ventilation required for the basement.
Yes.
As the pipe route went through the first riser cupboard, it went through that riser cupboard up to the ceiling and then into the second riser cupboard.
Yes.
Those holes were to be filled, and the ventilation would have been provided through the, as you see earlier on, the louvered doors, which went out onto a landing, which went onto a door, which went out to the atrium, which went out to the front doors. So the ventilation in the riser cupboards, 1 and 2, on get the floor numbers right, the floor above the basement and the next floor, that's how the ventilation, the designers satisfied the ventilation requirements. As it went into the storeroom, before it went into the stairwell, there was a door, so all of those holes should have been filled in, or would have been filled in, between the basement and as it come into the stairwell.
Yeah.
So they would have been filled in, and the ventilation was through the door, people going into the rooms, door movements, and then the route outside. That's the intent of the design.
Right.
And then the stairwell was
the stairwell's separate. Yeah. I understand. Let's just look at an image, some photographs which help us visualise this. If we go to RHX, 6012 at page 30. These images at the top of the page show the riser going, so this is the area between the basement and the lower part of the stair. So on the left, we've got the riser entering the utilities shaft at ground floor. Then we've got it going up the utilities shaft, and then we've got the riser exiting the utilities shaft at second floor. And you're saying that there was ventilation in these spaces because, there were doors onto these spaces. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there were doors onto these spaces that had louvers in the riser cupboards. So the two riser cupboards that you're showing there had doors which had louvers on.
Right, and that's, even though it's not documented in the design, that's how this ventilation was supposed to work.
That was the intent of the design, yes,
right,
in terms of the ventilation.
Yes. And can you help us as to why we also don't see any calculations which are carried out in relation to the ventilation, and suggesting that this design was going to be adequate in terms of the ventilation that it provided?
At the time, there was no calculations that supported that design.
Should there have been?
Yes, there should have been.
Yeah. And that was an omission
Yes.
in the design process. Yeah. Now, in terms of compartmentation, I just want to look at some discussions that occurred about breaching the stair wall into the lobby. If we can go to TMO 00833-486. This is an email chain between Charlie Saul at the TMO. We saw before that he was the contact point at the TMO on this issue.
Yeah.
And Harvey Smith of tRIIO, and also Martin Wiskin, the designer, is copied in. Yes.
Yes,
And Harvey Smith was the project manager.
that's correct.
Yes. And if we look at page 2 of this chain first, midway down is an email from Harvey Smith to Charlie Saul on the 18th of November 2016. And we can see that he referred to the design of the gas riser, and he asked for permission from the TMO to complete the works. So he says, please find attached the design for the above. I've been advised that buyout is not an option for this block, so would be grateful if you could review the design and confirm whether permission will be granted to complete the works. And then if we scroll up to the top of page 1, we can see the email back from Charlie Saul to Harvey Smith, 24th of November 2016. And he says, good afternoon, Harvey. I'm wondering if you could please answer a couple of queries with regard to the boxing around the pipework to be installed. What is the finish to the boxing? How will the boxing affect the fire safety of the block? With regards to fire safety, we are querying if the boxing will compromise the compartmentation of the stairs, lobby areas. It's not clear from the plans if the boxing will end in the lobby or continue into the stairwell. The worry is that if the boxing continues into the stairwell, then this will allow the passage of smoke through the block. How could the flow of smoke be controlled within the open-ended boxing? So some questions are being asked by the TMO about the boxing in and compartmentation in this email. And then if we go to the response from Martin Wiskin at TMO 100-15271, this is a response the same day, 24th of November 2016. And he says, Martin Wiskin says this, the intention is that the boxing will isolate the pipework from the mechanical ventilation in the communal areas. It will be vented directly to the stairwell at one end, which itself is well ventilated, and run to a dead end at the point of entry to the individual flats at the other. In case of fire in the stairwell, any smoke will travel along the boxing to a dead end and would be isolated within the boxing. In turn, any smoke within the communal area would not get into the stairwell, as the boxing would be fire rated. So Martin Wiskin is explaining how compartmentation was intended to be preserved in this first design, yes?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And at the same time, these questions were referred to the TMO's fire risk assessor, Mr. Carl Stokes. If we can go to TMO 100-15305. Now, you can take it from me that in this chain, we see that Janice Ray of the TMO forwards this chain of correspondence to Mr. Stokes. And at the top, we can see Mr. Stokes's email of the 25th of November 2016. And he says this, all noted, but what happens if the fire is in the flat? Does that mean that the fire can travel via the boxing to the stairwell? This is notifiable work, so I am assuming that all the work will go through the building regulations process and meet all the requirements of the building regulations. Can the utility company please provide a full method statement and schedule of works showing that all the work will meet the building regulations requirements? So that's Mr. Stokes's response. Now, just pausing there, did tRIIO think at the time that this gas riser work was notifiable to building control?
We didn't, when we was producing the design, no.
And can you just explain why you didn't think it was notifiable?
It was, we just to, in terms of the response earlier on, the designers and the design team understood by designing the riser system to G5 that the requirements of the building regulations would be required. And in submitting that design to the TMO, Charlie Saul, for approval, our understanding would be that the TMO would deal with building control if they felt it was a requirement.
Right. Did anybody with expertise in fire safety ever check tRIIO's designs, so on your side of the fence, to make sure there was nothing about the design that would impact and compromise fire safety in the building?
No, we didn't.
Now, we can see that Mr Stokes has raised a question about the effect of the boxing in and the potential effect of smoke travelling from a flat which is on fire to the stairwell. Let's just look at the response to that. If we can go at tRI 60405. And if we look at the second email down on that first page, on the 28th of November 2016, we can see that Martin Wiskin gets back to Carl Stokes and he says, Carl, our pipework must be installed in accordance with IGEM G5. This in turn has been written in accordance with the building regs. All pipework will be fire stopped between fire compartments. Okay, so that's the response. And at the very top of the page, Carl Stokes has replied, thank you, Martin. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, looking at that response from Martin Wiskin, can we agree that it's unclear as to whether what he's talking about there is holes between flats and the lobby, which would be fire stopped, or holes between the stair wall and the lobby being fire stopped? He's not clear on that, is he?
It's not clear from the email.
No. And it's right, isn't it, that there was no intention, we've discussed this before, no intention of fire stopping in the final design around the pipe between the stairs and the lobby, because those oversized holes were necessary for the pipes to be ventilated back to the stairs, yes?
The designer assumed that the boxing in, or is, in terms of producing the design, with respect to the ventilation requirements, the boxing in of the laterals in the lobby in effect became part of the stairwell fire compartmentation.
Yes.
And the holes would need to be left open, so that if a gas escape, if gas did escape from the pipe in the lobby, it could find its way out to the stairwell,
yes,
which was ventilated, as I discussed earlier.
But you wouldn't get a dead end, as he described it, unless you had fire stopping between the flat and the lobby, would you?
There was a, in terms of, so as the
what I'm saying is, Mr. Wiskin described the boxing in as providing a dead end at the end opposite to the stairs, and you would only get a dead end if you fire stopped the hole between the lobby and the flat, wouldn't you?
The dead end Martin was referring to was where the boxing in ended within the lobby would have been a dead end.
Yeah.
So there'd been a dead end. So the boxing in, if you can visualise a boxing in being constructed, it may have ended up at that wall there. That would have been the dead end, yeah. And then there'd have been an open end with a hole into the stairwell.
But there would only have been a dead end if the hole through which the pipe inside the boxing entered the flat had been fire stopped, wouldn't it? Otherwise, smoke could go through into the flat.
They were so the holes into the the drilled holes in from the lobby into the flats were fire stopped.
Exactly.
Yes.
Which I have to say, when I read this succession of exchanges, it seemed to me that he was talking about, or must have been talking about, the hole into the flat. If you read the whole series of exchanges, that seems to me.
Yes. Martin's reference, in terms of when I've read the emails and clearly looking at this, is that he's deemed the fire compartmentation of the stairwell and the boxed-in pipe in the lobby to be one, and any hole other than the hole drilled between the stairwell and the lobby would be fire stopped.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I was only intervening because it seemed to me maybe you weren't entirely doing him justice by accepting that it wasn't clear what he was referring to, because I'm suggesting that perhaps in the context of all the exchanges it was fairly clear.
I think when you read the whole email trail, yes, in the context of the one email there, then yes, it is. I agree.
Yes, let's look. Carl Stokes actually then attends and writes a report in January 2017 after the rise has been built. If we just go to that, CST 403082. CST 403082. Is that there? Yes. Thank you. So we can see this is a letter of the 30th of January 2017 to Janice Ray at the TMO, and you can see from the first lines he says, "Thank you for asking me to comment on look at the installation of the new gas pipe work within Grenfell Tower," and then he gives a description of it. And then we can see, if we go to the bottom of page 3 under conclusions, at point 3 he says documentation should be provided by the gas contractor showing the fire rated materials used for the fire stopping of the compartment walls and the fire rating of the fire collars used. Sorry, I should have read point 2 first, I apologise. If you look at point 2, he says, all holes in compartment wall must be suitably fire stopped using fire rated materials of a minimum of 90 minutes fire rating. Do you see that?
Yes.
And can you see above that is a picture? We scroll up. He's got pipe penetrating the staircase landing, hole through the landing, hole not made good. And then above that, he's got gas pipe passing through the flat lift to lift lobby area compartment wall. What fire stopping materials have been used to infill this hole around the pipe? Now, just looking at what Carl Stokes says at point 2 of his conclusions. He says all holes in compartment wall must be suitably fire stopped using fire rated materials. He doesn't distinguish there, does he, between the holes between the lobby and the flats and the holes between the stair and the lobby?
Yes.
Now, is it possible that there was a failure of communication between tRIIO and Carl Stokes on this point, in that he thought that all these holes needed to be fire stopped and didn't appreciate that part of the design left some of these holes open for ventilation purposes?
That may very well may be the case. I don't recall seeing this document myself,
right.
and whether or not it was passed to the designers at the time, or just to Miss Ray, and whether or not she passed that to us.
Yes, because certainly the photo we can see there on the screen, pipe penetrating the staircase landing, hole through the landing, the hole not made good. That comment, the hole not made good, perhaps suggests that he doesn't appreciate that there's got to be a hole around that pipe for the staircase to ventilate properly, hasn't there?
That's exactly right, yes.
Yeah. Now, it was shortly after this exchange that the design was settled and agreed. If we can look at TMO 008289115, TMO 008289115. This is an email chain between tRIIO and the TMO on the 30th of November 2016, and if we can go within it to page 3, we can see there's an email from Charlie Saul in the bottom half of that page to Martin Wiskin and Harvey Smith, And he says, thank you, Martin. Our Health and Safety Department have asked the following questions of the proposal. And we can see he wants a method statement, a schedule of works, and then the third bullet is confirm that works will meet building regulations. And then on page 2, if we go up, midway down the page, the first email is from Harvey Smith to Charlie Saul. In the third paragraph down, he writes, we do comply with building regulations and will take advice from you or your engineers on the fire rating required for this particular installation. And then he goes on and talks about other points. And then if we go up to the first page, at the top is an email from Charlie Saul on the 30th of November 2016. And in the second line, he writes, please proceed with works as laid out in the plans discussed. Now, do you understand that this was the TMO's approval of the design for the works and their instruction to proceed?
Yes.
And we know that subsequently on the 9th of December 2016, works did commence at the tower. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Now, we know that concurrently with these events, there was also parallel consideration being given to the option of buying out the gas. And I've just got a few questions for you on that now. Can you just describe in your own words what you understand the phrase buying out the gas to mean?
Yeah, so the risers in the building, in terms of the riser that was cut off, supplied 13 of the 20 flats. There is an option open to Cadent to pay financial settlement for the gas customer not to have a gas supply. And I think it's a Cadent process, but it comes down to some economics around whether or not it's economically viable to replace the riser system or buy it out in terms of financial remuneration in regards to that. So that is the option to buy out the gas supply.
Right.
And that is available or was available on and may very well be still available on MOBS projects.
Yes. So your understanding is there will be a kind of some form of economic assessment being made of the cost of replacement versus the cost of buyout.
That's
is that
correct,
your understanding?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Yeah. And through November, there were exchanges between the TMO and tRIIO about the option to buy out the gas. Now, we heard evidence from Peter Madison from the TMO about this. I don't think we need to go to the transcript, but he said in his evidence that his preference was that they removed the gas supply from the block. He said he felt that running the new gas supply through the block was unnecessary and felt that they should buy out the residents and put in electric. Now, as far as you were aware, at tRIIO, did you get the clear impression that the TMO's preference was to have the gas decommissioned and for there to be buyout of those customers?
I can't recollect that from the TMO. We would have been dealing directly with the client, Cadent, and have asked that question as to whether or not it was an option. And that would have been the extent of our involvement in terms of the buyout process.
Right. So your involvement in that process was pretty limited.
It was a question of, is it an option for us? And the client would have looked at it and made that decision and informed us of that decision, which on this occasion it wasn't. It was conveyed to us that it wasn't available.
Yeah. Yeah. In your experience, was it your understanding that the decision to buy out was focused predominantly on the wishes of the customers in the flats themselves and less about the wishes of the building owner?
My understanding of the process and is a Cadent process, but my understanding is that they need to get every customer within the building as agreement to buy it out. If they couldn't get agreement with all the customers, then they couldn't proceed with that option.
Yes. Let's just look at some emails on this. If we go to CAD 6058. We can see, yes, the second email down is from someone called Mary Ryan at Cadent on the 16th of November 2016. And from the second paragraph down, she says, with reference to your point on compensation, all gas users will be entitled to the maximum guaranteed standard of services compensation of £1,500. Please accept my apologies for not receiving any firm information from tRIIO to date on either a restoration or buyout proposal. The decision on whether a buyout is a viable solution rests with myself on behalf of National Grid, based on cost of replacement versus compensation to gas users. Is there any information you could share on confirmed gas users within the building to expedite this option? So she appears to be apologising for the fact that tRIIO haven't responded on this point, but saying buyout is actually a question for us, Cadent. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And then if we can go to CAD 6059, if we look at the bottom of page 1, we can see an email from Mary Ryan to Martin Wiskin at tRIIO, and she's on the 17th of November 2016, and she says, unfortunately, your colleagues have been stating that this is a buyout location to the local authority and National Grid for approximately the last month. You are correct. We will only buy out a whole building, not a single riser, etc. I have no idea what detail the discussions have reached with reference to the above, hence the chasing emails and information required on the TCONs. Is it your experience that Cadent won't buy out all of a building when only one riser has been cut off?
Yes.
That's what she's suggesting there.
Yes.
But in this situation, wasn't that rather illogical in circumstances where it had already been decided to replace the other risers via the new riser? So there would need to be quite extensive works to put that proactive programme in place.
Yes.
Do you know whether that was ever considered as part of the Grenfell project?
In terms of buying out the whole building?
Yes.
That is the buyout process.
Yes, but she seems to be saying we're only going to buy out a whole building, not a single riser, but not recognising that actually there had been a decision to replace all of the risers in the building. So in terms of the cost-benefit analysis that was being done,
Mary would have been aware of the proactive element of it.
She would she?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And just help us with this. In circumstances where buyout's been rejected as an option by Cadent, is it right that tRIIO could ask for that decision to be reopened if, for example, there were safety concerns about the riser design?
It would come back down to whether or not it was safe. We could construct a safe and compliant pipeline system. If we couldn't construct, say, safe and compliant system, then we shouldn't be putting gas back into that building, and I think that would have then started a different conversation around the buyout of the building.
Are you aware of instances with other projects where buyout's been rejected as an option? tRIIO have been asked to do replacement works, but then tRIIO have gone back to Cadent and said, I'm sorry, we've looked at this really carefully and it's simply not safe to do this. You're going to have to look at buyout again. Has that ever occurred in your experience?
Not in my experience.
No.
Not that I can recall.
Is it tRIIO's position that the route and the design was a safe and compliant one as things stood in November 2016?
It was, yes.
Right. And it's right, isn't it? tRIIO didn't ever come back to Cadent and reopen the buyout question because no safety concerns were raised about putting the riser through the stairs and the associated works.
Yeah, when the original buyout option was rejected, the question was asked. We proceeded to produce what we considered to be a safe and compliant design, and from that point on, we proceeded with the pre-construction and construction activity. So we never reverted back to asking the question.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the construction work, the construction of the new riser commenced on the 9th of December 2016. Does that sound right?
Yes. Yes.
The riser was then tested and commissioned by the 25th of January 2017, we believe.
Yep. Yes.
And then gas was reinstated to most of the flats ending in 2 by the 10th of March 2017.
That's correct.
Does that sound right? Yeah. And it's correct, isn't it, that the boxing in of the laterals in the lobbies, on the lobby side, was not complete by the time that the gas was reinstated. And it's right, isn't it, that this was not done by the time of the fire?
That is correct.
Now, that was not in line with the ventilation and compartmentation design, was it?
That's correct.
During that period, so when the boxing in hadn't been completed, wasn't there a danger that gas might have leaked but could not ventilate naturally? It would ventilate into the communal lobbies and not to the staircase and then the outside as intended.
The holes between the stairwell and the lobby were the oversized holes were still open. They were open. What hadn't happened was the boxing in. So yes, the answer to that is, although there was a route out to the stairwell, the ventilation of the boxing in wasn't complete, and therefore the full ventilation process hadn't been completed.
Yes, so you've got a situation where if there's a gas leak, the ventilation is inadequate during that period.
Yes.
Yes. And should that have happened in hindsight?
No.
No, it shouldn't have been left like that, should it?
No.
No, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good moment for the lunch break.
All right.
I'm making good progress, and I'm confident we certainly will be finished this afternoon.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, it sounds as though Council's going to move on to another topic, so that sounds like a very good point to have the break for lunch. We'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 2 o'clock. And again, as I asked before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Good. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock then, please.